All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out to Renal Grand Rounds. Really excited today to introduce you all to our Renal Grand Rounds speaker, Dr. Devin Peipert. And he is actually an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Social Sciences here at Northwestern in the Feinberg School of Medicine, and he's an investigator and psychometrician focusing on the application of patient-reported outcomes in patient-focused drug development and clinical monitoring to optimize patient management. So in this capacity, he works extensively on establishing evidence to qualify PROs as clinical outcomes assessments to implement in drug trials. And he also has a line of research generating and examining new tools and methods to quantify and manage drug intolerability across multiple therapeutic areas. So across these research areas, he's maintained a strong focus on kidney disease since the start of his career. And he really takes a cross-sector approach with significant support and collaboration with international regulators and drug developers. And that is shown very nicely by his over 100 peer-reviewed publications. He's worked with some of the people here like Dr. Friedewald, and I'm very lucky to get to work with him on the Prepare NS study, which we're going to hear about today. So warm welcome to you, Dr. Peipert. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shika. Thanks, everybody, for having me and for coming to the talk about PROs. So as Shika said, today we're going to talk about a particular project I'm working on in nephrotic syndrome. I think Shika said most of this stuff, so I'll just pass by that. So the structure of the talk. So first I'm just going to talk very briefly about what patient-reported outcomes are and why I think you should care, try to make a case for that. And then talk pretty generally about their role in drug development. Then I'll get on to the specific project, Prepare NS, and then end with some very brief kind of recommendations overall for clinical trials that I've taken from my work in this area. So PROs, what are they? Why should we care? Just starting sort of very basically, how do we learn about patients' health in any way? So we have, biomarkers, performance measures, things we're all very used to. And then we have things that patients can tell us about, symptoms, side effects, function. And in general, we think of this in terms of how does a patient feel, how does a patient function. And the only reason I show this really sort of basic elementary slide is that I want to distinguish the types of things you measure with patient-reported outcomes from like patient satisfaction surveys or, did you like your visit today and things like that. What we're talking about is really getting at, health states, health characteristics, health attributes, and measuring that using survey-type research. From the FDA's perspective, PRO is any report coming from patients about a health condition and its treatment without interpretation from anyone else. And so that's a definition they put forth in 2009, and it's hung around since then. So I'm just going to show an example as we're talking about nephrotic syndrome today. This is from a large effort out of Australia, but very international, called SONG, Standard Outcomes in Nephrology. And this is in glomerular disease in particular. And what they did is they sort of use these big consensus processes and have these huge meetings all over the world, a number of areas, where they sort of talk to different stakeholders, patients, caregivers, doctors, a variety of clinicians across the board, medical societies, et cetera, and figure out sort of, for any clinical trial, what are the outcomes that we should be measuring? And they're going to suggest a core set. And for glomerular disease, they sort of identified. And I'm going to try this. Oh, that's so cool how that comes up there. You can see in this little smallest circle here that's darkest red what they consider to be sort of the really most critically important outcomes to all the stakeholders. And here you have kidney function, disease activity, death, life participation, and cardiovascular disease. So you have a variety of different outcomes there, and at least two of them can be measured through patient report, and one of them probably has to be life participation. So those made the top bucket, and then you have sort of going down from there a variety of things that sort of, again, cover the gamut. And so this isn't to argue that patient report should replace any other type of health measurement we do, biomarkers, et cetera. That's all critical and required, of course. But patient report has its place as well, and especially in the context of trials and drug development. And so in nephrotic syndrome in particular, PROs have started to emerge as a useful way to describe patients' health. And so this is a paper that came out a little while ago from a variety of investigators here in the Midwest, including some folks at Lurie, because this is focused on children, and I don't want to spend loads of time on it, but I do want to walk you through this a little bit to just demonstrate how PROs can really differentiate the health experience of patients in this condition. So what we have here on the sort of first column is a series of PRO measures measured with the PROMIS system, and the scores for these work such that higher scores indicate more of the concept. And then these are all kids with nephrotic syndrome, and they either have edema here in this column or they don't, and then you have the number and then the mean score. So I'm just going to run through these a little bit. You can see when kids have swelling, edema, they have more anxiety, a mean of 50 versus 44 with a moderate effect size. Pain, a mean of 51, 45. Fatigue, a mean of 50 versus 42, so that's a particularly big difference. And then you see big differences in mobility here with patients without edema having better mobility. I know PROs are always on this kind of arbitrary metrics, or like, what do these numbers mean to me? These are all pretty big differences, coming from the PRO world. And so I'm just showing this to show that in this condition, in nephrotic syndrome, patient-reported outcomes are pretty good at describing what's going on with the patient in terms of their health and when things get better or not, and tracking their disease activity. So just stepping away from that for just a few minutes, let's talk more generally about the role of patient-reported outcomes in drug development, and then we'll come back to how that plays into what we're going to do in nephrotic syndrome. So patient-focused drug development is kind of a term of art that has emerged. I think the FDA made it up and then put it out into their guidances, and then now it's starting to be picked up. But in general, this describes a systematic approach to help ensure patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. Some major goals of patient-focused drug development include, what I just said, sort of really being systematic and scientific about the collection of patient-reported data to inform drug development and regulatory decision-making, sort of methods development, encouraging identification, use of approaches to facilitate patient enrollment and minimizing the patient burden in clinical trials or other drug development efforts. And then, the last bullet I think here is among the most important, identifying information that's most important to patients related to treatment, benefit, risks, and burden, and how to communicate that and use that in their own decision making. And so I think that really gets at the heart of, what we do, what we want to do with PROs and patient-centric measurement in the context of drug development is describe treatment benefit, treatment risk, and really use that in the context of, hey, when should people be taking this drug and when they shouldn't be. A lot of this was ushered in, although it didn't start with the 21st Century Cares Act, 2016, 2017, but this had a provision for really wanting patient experience data, patient reported data in drug evaluations going forward. So this is something that the FDA is looking at and taking pretty seriously. They consider PROs to be drug development tools, and a drug development tool is a method, material, or measure that can aid in drug development. And this would be any type of health or measure that we use, biomarkers, et cetera. PRO has a place in that context. And so these can be qualified by the FDA. So the FDA does have drug development tool qualification programs for biomarkers, animal models, et cetera, other ways that we look at health and trials. But clinical outcome assessments is part of that qualification program as well. And a clinical outcome assessment is another sort of term of art pushed out by the FDA that really get at measures of patient symptoms, overall mental state, disease or condition, et cetera, that include PROs but are not limited to PROs. So you have clinical outcome assessments here in the middle, and then you have PROs, which we've been talking about and defined, so we know what that is. You have performance measures, you have observer-reported outcomes, that's OBSRO, digital health technologies, and clinician-reported outcomes. So these are all falling under the gamut of clinical outcome assessments, which you can think of as sort of patient-centric measurement approaches that get at the patient's experience. There has been some effort to qualify PROs in the context of kidney disease, though not in nephrotic syndrome, focused on CKD in pediatric space, two different PROMISE tools, which is a PRO measurement system we have here at Northwestern, around fatigue and sleep disturbance have been put forth and are in some level of consideration in that program. Unfortunately, nothing in nephrotic syndrome yet. FDA, in their effort to try to get sponsors, drug developers to do this, has pushed out a large and very robust series of methodological guidances. And so if you work in clinical trials and drug development, there's all types of FDA guidances, and they have these around their expectations for if you're going to use a PRO or other clinical outcome assessment, what measurement properties should it have, how should you choose it, and how should you analyze data coming from those types of outcomes to make a case for treatment, benefit, risk, et cetera, if you're going to do regulatory review. Here's the release schedule on those. So we're about wrapping this up. This started with the CARES Act and then was actually required by the CARES Act in 2017. They covered a variety of aspects, from how do you collect comprehensive and representative input, identifying what's important to patients, selecting, developing, or modifying fit for purpose, which is, really, in the context of use that you have, what's your clinical area, what's the drug you're studying, what PRO or other clinical outcome assessment is going to be the one to use, and then how do you actually prepare those data for submission to them, the FDA. And there was a series of public workshops, there were draft versions, and then some final versions. The first three have final versions now, and the draft version of the last one came out late 2023, and hopefully will be finalized soon. And they have a whole department or division of clinical outcome assessment. So they have people taking this very seriously methodologically. In nephrotic syndrome, as you all know probably better than me, drug development is a pretty active area. So a somewhat recent clinical trials.gov review last summer, we found 29 active trials in FSGS with nephrotic syndrome, 28 in membranous nephropathy with nephrotic syndrome. 41 of those were early phase, meaning, if they do well and move on, then you'll see them popping up later for later phase trials. And only 5 of those studies, though, had PROs, and none of the PROs were tailored to nephrotic syndrome. And some of them, while they were, sort of what was available to the researchers that were designing these trials and trialists, available to them to choose from, they weren't they weren't sort of targeted enough to create to really test hypotheses about how the drugs might be working on specific health outcomes covered by PROs. And so really sort of drives towards the need for a patient-reported outcome or other clinical outcome assessments that get at the experience of nephrotic syndrome. You can see other primary categories of outcomes here. And this is stuff you would expect. Okay, so leaving that aside, that's just a general thing. What are we going to do to address this particular gap? Well, FDA does care quite a bit about nephrotic syndrome specifically, and they, in addition to their qualification program, have this grant series, pilot grant series through CEDAR, to generate standard core clinical outcomes, or sets of clinical outcomes and related endpoints. And in 2021, they put a second round of this out. Sorry, this text is probably very small, but it's important to look. One of the things they highlighted was they wanted to see COAs and associated endpoints to assess volume or fluid overload and related impacts for use in nephrotic syndrome trials. So that's great news and fills the gap that we just pointed to. So we responded to that and were fortunately successful, which is how we came to create the Prepare&S project, which stands for Preparing a Clinical Outcome Assessment for Nephrotic Syndrome. And now I'm going to switch the look of my slides to be the branded Prepare&S slide look. And this is a collaboration between us here at Northwestern and the University of Michigan. Originally, the MPIs were myself and Deb Gibson there, but some folks may know she's moved on to a new position in IDDK. So then one of her faculty, Eloise Salmon, has taken over that role, and now Eloise and I are the MPIs of Prepare&S. And we have a variety of faculty and staff from both institutions who participate regularly in the project, including Dr. Vavani and Patrick Fox here, who are really experts in this area. So very lucky to have this robust partnership for this project. And the goal of this is develop and validate a publicly available set of clinical outcome assessments, a fluid overload fit for development, or fit for drug development in a range of nephrotic syndrome inducing rare chronic kidney diseases. So here's just a brief overview of the cycle of this, and this is a UG3 UH3 mechanism. So I don't know if folks are familiar with that particular mechanism where you get the grant and you get the UG3 part, and that's kind of like a design time, and you have some years, and then you have to sort of make a case to go move on to the UH3 part. And so there's a number of activities here, starting with sort of the very basic things that you would do to develop any set of new PROs, literature reviews, scoping interviews, summarizing that evidence, finding the gaps, and then sort of really proposing and making a case for what do we think the set of measures should be as we go forward. And then the goal would be to try to test those in the UH3 part. And what came up almost immediately that we had not originally proposed was the need for an observer-reported outcome in addition to a patient-reported outcome. So we do include very young children. And so, how reliably can you get patient report from kids? Not very reliably. And so what you need to focus on then is their parents or their caregiver who can report on things that are observable for them. And so where we are now is we just moved on to the UH3 part after 2 years of design. And so we've been a little quiet during that time because we've been sort of just figuring out what we were going to do, doing a lot of formative work, and I'll present some of the progress from that today. But you can see here this entailed a good amount of sort of formative background work, some of which I reviewed on the last slide. But We've gone into the Neptune and CureGN databases. We've done a lot of qualitative interviews. We've done kind of numerous interviews with industry stakeholders, with other clinical trialists, and we've now are at the point where we've sort of drafting these proposed measures that we would like to then validate in this next stage of the grant. And we're doing that starting in the spring. And so the aims of that first part were to convene a bunch of stakeholders and get their opinions, confirm the conditions we're going to study, and really develop the measures that we're going to use. And then and just kind of summarizing again, the aims of the second phase were to produce a set of PROs and now OBSRO measures for use across a number of chronic conditions. And so I just want to, I'm not going to go through every name here, but just to kind of show you the level of input and involvement we have from a variety of groups here. So one of the groups is a external technical advisory committee, which has internationally people from all over who have expertise in measure development. A clinical expert panel, which has loads of clinicians, as you would expect, covering both adult and pediatric nephrology, mostly nephrologists, but we do have some other clinical roles there as well as a stakeholder engagement group, which has a number of people, whether they're patients or caregivers of patients who are affected, industry stakeholders, people from the relevant societies involved who really we meet with on a fairly regular basis and are able to draw, not only get sort of their input on what they would like to see, but have them review materials, the decisions we're making, and really inform. So since this is kind of the scope is national in the sense that, at the end of this, what we would try to have is a set of measures that, would hopefully be used in majority of nephrotic syndrome trials. We're all along the way incorporating input from, this variety of stakeholders and not just sort of secreted away in by ourselves coming up with something to then force onto the world in this drug development community specifically. So just want to talk briefly about sort of the overall kind of model we're using here. So to think about what we should measure and what kind of consideration should ultimately go into developing measures of the impact of swelling and nephrotic syndrome. So we know, of course, that swelling is caused by a set of biological and physiological factors that lead to fluid overload. And then the fluid overload itself has a variety of symptoms, a level of severity that impacts patients' lives, right, and people's lives. And that's what we're going to tap to try to capture. In addition to that, we know there's a lot of social function and mental function impacts as well that we'll talk a little bit more as we go along, but that's harder to use in the context of drug development. So you think about, if you're going to have an endpoint that you're going to submit and say, okay, this is going to reveal treatment benefit on this particular drug, to what extent and how proximal is something like social participation or mental functioning, while probably severely affected, hard to sort of evaluate a drug on that basis. So those have been not in primary consideration for us. And really what we're looking at is what's in the teal kind of box here. So the context of use that we settled on after a lot of that review and background and then discussion was that we're going to be looking at 2 years and older, so starts pretty young and goes as old as people can get. And then people with nephrotic syndrome caused by FSGS, minimal change disease, IgM nephropathy, membranous nephropathy, and childhood onset not biopsied. And so we think this gets out of a good portion of where a lot of drug development activity is now. IgA was suggested at first, but we did not ultimately get that into the context of use. So there's a lot of activity in IgA. I think there was some consideration that the phenotype of IgA symptomatically would be little bit different and maybe kind of required its own focus as opposed to some of these other diseases. And so we are including folks with CKD, all levels, kidney function and kidney transplant recipients, although excluding dialysis dependency rather. And both persistent disease as well as relapse and remitting, and that has created some interesting challenges for trial design. So, one of the things for folks who treat these patients know swelling can come up and be sort of the worst thing that can ever happen, and then once it's controlled, it completely goes away. So if you've got a set of questions that ask about the impact of swelling or how bad your swelling is, last week it could have been extremely severe, and this week it's like there's nothing happening. And so, and so in the context of clinical trials, we have to figure out a way to look at both types of disease activity, excluding diabetic nephropathy, IgA, and Alport syndrome. So we did a large analysis of sort of the landscape and what was out there in terms of PRO measures and other patient-centric measures that already existed, because why reinvent the wheel? I think I've already told you earlier on there was a gap, but we needed to confirm that evidence-wise and going to publish this soon. So through looks at clinicaltrials.gov as well as a systematic literature review, we found that there were some measures already focusing on nephrotic syndrome, specifically FSGS, minimal change disease, and childhood onset, but really nothing focusing on IgM or membranous nephropathy. And that was all for patient report. There was nothing at all from the observer's perspective that could really serve if you had young children. In this context, that means 2 to 8. Looking at measurement of the critical symptoms in fluid overload, most of these were broadly focused on the full experience of nephrotic syndrome, whereas for this particular application, we need to focus on what's happening in relationship to the edema, right? So you can have a lot of impacts of edema, and those can be the same as what's happening with the disease more generally or other things you have going in your life. But our challenge is to create a set of measures that capture what happens as a consequence of the edema. Another interesting measurement challenge. And then sort of, as I just said, what's the impact of the edema on your life more broadly in a way that can then be tied to disease activity and then drug development, right? So we want stuff that's going to be responsive to, if a drug works, what's going to change in a positive way to show treatment benefit. And again, there was really nothing on fluid overload impact out there. So while there's some sort of starting material, raw materials out there, we're now in the phase of really figuring out to what extent can we leverage any of that for a new set of measures. Some of the work we've been doing has been focused on a good deal of qualitative interviews with both patients and then parents of patients. And so this is the building block of developing a patient-reported measure or observer-reported measure, and this is kind of mandated through the guidance that FDA pushed out that I showed you earlier, where they really want to, when you choose a PRO, to decide what goes in the PRO, you have to go to the patient or affected person first and say, what do they care about? What's meaningful to them? What is it going to look like to them? And as much as possible, how do they describe that symptomatic or functional experience? And then the measure has to reflect that. And good reasons for that. And so you do that by talking to people, right, in a systematic way. So we conducted a total of 26 concept elicitation interviews with parents of children aged 2 to 11. Some younger individuals can report on their own, starting with 8 or 9, but we do know that some parents will be reporting for their children a little bit older than that. So there's some overlap in what gets covered there. But this concept elicitation is really the process of going out and conducting interviews and trying to get as much spontaneous input, unprompted by your own sort of thinking as the researcher, into how to reflect the patient experience in terms of symptoms and impacts. All the participants had a current or history of swelling related to nephrotic syndrome in the past 3 months. So that's been a major challenge, to just find people and catch them at that period, right? Because we want their disease to be controlled, so we want them to not have swelling for very long, but we got to try to talk to them in that window. And we've been recruiting quite a bit through Neptune, CureGN, Kidney Research Network, and then just through the community as well. Again, as I mentioned, the objective of these was to determine how nephrotic syndrome impacts the child's functioning in ways that the parent can observe. And I'll take a brief moment to distinguish that from other elements that might be sort of permissible in the PRO setting versus an OBSRO setting, because everyone's equipped and prepared to talk about how they feel, what their experience is. So if you think about things like pain quality, pain intensity, fatigue, etc., I can tell you that about myself. But it's very hard to observe those types of things in other people. I can't tell you how nauseous someone is, even though they may be exhibiting some elements of that. That if you want to have a sensitive and specific measure, it's hard to do. And so what OBSROs have to focus on really is what can you observe, in a more objective sense. And the results of all this material was used to identify priority concepts to go into the PRO. And so after those, we identified some concepts, and this is in a bit of a sort of a weird format, because this is the way that FDA sort of likes it to be submitted, where you identify all these concepts that really, and these are broad, so you can see these sort of break down that your patients identified as being important to the questions you were asking. And then you sort of class those into what can you actually include in the measure for this purpose in drug development. And you can see there's physical function, physical symptoms, essential function, and distress behaviors, as well as social participation. I mean, we're talking about the kid's experience. The social participation comes up quite a bit. You can imagine if a kid is, put on 10, 15 pounds of fluid over the course of a day or two, that's really going to impact, whether or not they can go to school, what happens at school, can they do all their schoolwork, what's the relationship with their peers like, etc. But again, there's been really a message that that stuff is, while very important clinically, is hard to tie to drug activity. And so we are not including that in the set of questions for this specific purpose. Breaking down these health concepts, you have a bunch of subdomains. Physical function means mobility, how much can you walk around, activities of daily living, and upper extremity function and dexterity. And mobility and activities of daily living really are highly impacted quite a bit. So the amount of fluid put on is so severe that within the course of a day, you can go from being fully functional walking around to, I just got to be in bed, right? Physical symptoms mean appetite, interruptions, fatigue, sleep disturbance, a lot of pretty severe GI stuff, and pain. dyspnea in terms of essential functions. So, are you short of breath? Can you not see because the eyes is where swelling starts quite a bit, and so sometimes vision is impaired. Urination restriction because of swelling in that region, and then distress behaviors are of course common among kids. And so we talked about all these are critically important, going to be sort of looked at. How we have to try to figure out how to ask the questions in a way that you can really get at some of this stuff in the way that a patient or a parent can describe about their kid. You can't just rate your child's pain from 0 to 10. You have to say, well, what behaviors were they exhibiting, et cetera. And so we're in the process of figuring that out now. Here are just some example quotes. I find that these really, sort of enrich the description here much more than kind of the research description around mobility. And this is just a selection. Around the mobility and walking, you had a report, of a parent about their kid. Sometimes she waddles because she gets so big, like a little penguin. She just waddles around. So that's a sort of showing the interruption with walking. Activities of daily living. Putting the clothes on is tough. Putting the socks and shoes on is tough. Bending down to just like reach his toes. And that's something we hear a lot about. A lot of families have two sets of clothes, one for when they're swollen, one for when they're not swollen. Fatigue, very, very low energy, would just want to lay around all day. Another common experience. Pain, when she was swollen like over body, she was having pain from just even the most sensitive touch. And so very, very severe symptomatic experience that we were able to learn about. Now, we did the same thing again in the patient-reported outcome. I won't describe the method in detail because it was the same, but it was just talking to people 8 years and above, and we did 32 of those interviews. Objective is the same. We came to a conceptual model that overall matched, of course, some of the elements like distress behaviors, school, stuff like that is less relevant once you get past adolescence, into adulthood. But we do have kids down to 8 participating in the patient report. So some of that stuff does overlap, and you see, a similar set of concepts, but maybe emerging in slightly different ways. The swelling experience for adults maybe would be less acute, more chronic, but not always as severe. Of course, there's huge variation there. More quotes here. Couldn't walk anywhere, going to the mailbox, something like that. I couldn't make myself urinate. Nausea was worst. Really, again, severe symptomatic and functional impact for kids and then adults. So what are we going to do next with this information? We are currently drafting the OBSRO and PRO to be tested in a set of cognitive debriefing interviews, and that's what we're sort of working on now. So what that means is we took all this sort of content that we got out of these interviews, and then we looked at a bunch of different PRO questionnaires that already existed and said, where do you really have the match? Where's the content match and conceptual coverage? And so we're going to have to demonstrate, and we have demonstrated to the FDA that we found that match, and we've selected questions, and as much as possible captures the words that the patients and their parents use to really get at these things. The goal is to create something that's going to be responsive to changes in these symptoms, right? The cognitive debriefing part is to then take the questions we've chosen back out, again, to the same sets of not the same individuals, but patients matching the same clinical profile and say, do these make sense to you? Do they capture your experience? Would you say it differently? Can you understand it, et cetera? In the spring of this year, 2024, into the summer, we're planning a large-scale quantitative validation study. So this would be probably, we're looking at 200 for the PRO and 100 for the OBSRO, and again, multi-site effort where we would really get into the reliability, validity, responsiveness to change type of analyses that would then get these measures prepared for use in clinical trials. As part of that effort, we're not just going to be stopping at creating the patient-reported outcome and OBSROs. We're also going to be bringing together folks to reach what we think are the right endpoints for clinical trials. There's a difference between just the outcome measure itself, right, and then how do you actually use that to determine treatment benefits. So PROs have these kind of arbitrary scales. It's 0 to 100 or whatever, and then so that's the outcome. The endpoint is like, how much change over what period of time is going to indicate a treatment benefit and make those suggestions so that these are really clinical trial ready. We're also looking at, in addition to sort of what you might think of as more like time point oriented, multi-item scales for the PRO and OBSRO that you would say, okay, we're going to do it at baseline, then we're going to do it 3 months later and see how much you change. We're also looking at developing daily diary measures for both that would be much more brief, but can really capture that impact and how things change over the course of just a few days or within a day for relapse and remitting disease, and see how that might fit in as well. And so that's in the earliest planning stages at the moment. Some final notes. So at the end of Prepare&S, we'll have a core set of PROs and OBSROs to fit for purpose as endpoints in clinical trials across multiple diagnoses. And really, I think, the goal of this is that to create some efficiency in the drug development and review process. So a lot of time is spent, so a developer will come and say, okay, we know that there's probably going to be a PRO endpoint for this drug. FDA, what do you like? Do you like this one? Type C meeting. Okay, well, now we're going to go back, try again. Maybe you need to go do some more research. The hope is that, when you come in with a trial design and a drug sort of plan for registration, say, to the FDA, and they say, look, we'd like to really see what the impact is on swelling, there's something that everyone already agrees on captures that impact. So you don't have to go back and spend the next year or two figuring out what's the right PRO endpoint for that. You can just kind of move forward. And so hopefully we'll accomplish that. As we launch into the validation study, and even in our qualitative work that we're working on now, we definitely want to build collaborations and work with everyone we can. I think I mentioned that we're trying to recruit patients while swelling is active or within 3 months, and that's a tight window. So we've Shika knows and Pat knows we've been trying really hard to find and identify patients who meet that, and sort of working as hard as we can, but having the broadest network we can is going to be helpful, and we are recruiting patients into the study now. So if this will lead you to our website, some information about participation in the study and in the qualitative elements of the study, and we are doing this at Northwestern already, so probably but just in case, if you want to pass on to somebody or anything, get the word out. Okay, so that was Prepare&S. Just to wrap up here, I'm gonna sort of run through some very basic but I think important recommendations for future trial design in nephrotic syndrome, of course, but in kidney disease more generally. So in future NS trials, and all trials really in kidney disease, I think should increase the use of PROs, OBSROs, et cetera, clinical outcome assessments that can really reveal the patient experience. And we know patients have identified this as important to them in terms of, hey, if I'm going to take this treatment, I want to know not only does my GFR improve, but also what's my life going to be like, and so that's really critical. We know that regulators want it, and so I think now we're in the phase of how do we really make this real, and so that's a recommendation. I think getting patients and other stakeholder partners involved in the design and of drug development and trials as early as possible is really important. So there's a number of patient advocates out there who are really trying to do this more and more, and I think that's great. Even if there's not a PR endpoint that's like the most important for a labeling claim or registration or approval. Just talking to patients about, hey, this is what we think the drug's going to do. What else would you like? And I know folks already do this quite a bit, but I think the extent to which we can increase that activity is really going to have a positive impact on the kidney disease community. And then, one of the things that comes up with this is isn't this sort of a logistical nightmare, right? You've got this collaboration with a regulator, you're talking to all these pharmaceutical industries, you got patient groups involved, all these things, a lot of people to manage, maybe you'd say a lot of cats to herd. And so yes, it is painful, but I think it's actually really useful in generating something that's going to be meaningful at the end of the day to a variety of stakeholders. And so a lot of what happened in the early days of inclusion of PROs in clinical trials more broadly was just hey, let's pull one down from the shelf, throw it on there, see what happens. Oh, there's no treatment benefit, or it's different from this trial, this trial, this trial. We don't even know what these mean anyway. learn from those lessons, And so this is an attempt to really take seriously, if we want to start thinking about this in terms of treatment benefit means not only I have less proteinuria, but I'm less swollen, I can go to work, I can play, I can do all the things I want to do. This is the input that you have to get up front and work with everybody up front, and the extra work, I think, is worth it so far. And with that, I'll wrap up and just thank everybody for your attention, inviting me to talk, and hope to talk to you more.